about what's happening.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's been 84 years, right? So long. Okay, good evening, everyone. Yeah, really, really nice to see all of you. How's your mood, folks? How are you feeling? Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah. I personally had a very long day, so I'm freaking tired. So yeah, hopefully this will be useful for you, as exciting and thrilling for me. So I'm really glad that you all show up here. So yeah, my talk is going to be sort of like an intro to UI UX. Who the hell am I? My name is Brazdeikis. I'm a senior UI designer currently working at Frontier Developments, a UK studio. I've been in the industry for almost a decade now, which actually, makes me crumble into dust just as I think about this. I started in the outsource way back when, was really, really lucky to join some of really high-profile projects as a web designer mostly, doing companion apps for franchises like Dragon Age and Mass Effect. But this wasn't really game development per se, because I was really into trying to do some games myself in-house. So then I joined a company called Game Insight. Worked there a bunch, but this was primarily like a mobile company. Had some other partnerships along the lines. I always wanted to transition into AAA development, PC and console development. And so over the years, I had many different titles I had a chance to work on. Last year, one of my freshest releases was Jurassic World Evolution 2, and currently I'm working at the Warhammer Age of Sigmar project. So you could say I've done it all. I've done web, mobile, PC, consoles, pitching, you name it, really. And there were projects that I wore many hats on, and projects that I could only wear one, essentially. But eventually I had to specialize in something, because at some point I was, on several projects, I was essentially the only person responsible for all things 2D, right? But eventually I had to specialize, eventually I had to find my niche, and my niche became UI UX, which I'm really, really glad about. So the plan for today's presentation is going to be like this. We're going to talk about what is UI, what is UX, what are the core pillars for each of these disciplines, what do they mean, and how to work with them, and what kinds of people usually work with them in the industry, and how they're called. And yeah, eventually I'm going to try to suggest some further reading, some links and useful materials that you can get acquainted with further. Okay, cool. So I guess we should start with the basics, right? The topics of UI and UX are incredibly deep, extremely broad, and honestly, a lot of companies, even like AAA companies, sometimes struggle with defining what these fields actually mean and what kinds of people should work on them and what kind of skill set is required to be successful in these fields. So yeah, what I want to do, I want to share some of my experience and my views and some of the more codified views on these fields. What do they mean for folks? And we're going to start with UI, which is here on the left. So yeah, a user interface is the aggregate of means by which people, the users, interact with a particular product, which is the system. So it can be a machine, it can be a device, a computer program. In our case, it's the game. So a lot of difficult words here. I'm going to bring up my favorite example, which is a microwave, right? A microwave can heat up dinner, but in order to convert your desire to eat some hot chicken into something that this machine can understand, you need to interact with a dashboard. So the dashboard here is the sort of UI that is relevant to the system. So these buttons, the timer, the whole dashboard, this is essentially user interface. You as a user interface with it, through it with this particular system. Of course, games are not any less complex than microwaves, and so they also need to accept various different commands from the users in order to interpret that into active gameplay. So yeah, let's take Tetris, for example, right? Fairly simple game by today's standards, but it actually encompasses a lot of the elements that are, unchanged throughout the years related to UI. Because, yeah, it's just a version of Tetris, GS Tetris in this case. But you can see that you're gonna need to start the game first, but then you're gonna need to see the stats. You're gonna need to see what's the next piece, how many lines left, how many time has passed, score and stuff like that. Stuff around the gameplay that helps you interact with the gameplay, essentially. So not too many user interface entities because it's a simpler game. But if we take a game like a more modern title, for example, Jurassic World Evolution 2, right, which I worked on, you can see that there are a lot more things that you can interact with, right? You can select various different modes from the game. You can consult with the help screen. You can browse through various different building menus. You can look at the stats of particular species, etc., etc., etc. So a lot more stuff to do, a lot more complex than Tetris, but the essence is practically the same for the UI itself, because the reason why it's there is because essentially it's there to help frame the core loop of the game, right? The 30 seconds of fun, if you will. All of these elements, they're there to complement the gameplay. They're there to enhance it, to make it more understandable for the end user, to make it easier for the end user to play the game. Unlike microwaves, of course, games have much more diverse set of instruments, of ways to convey various different information to the player, to provide feedback to the user, right? Because we can use 2D graphics, 3D graphics, various different sound cues and effects. We can use controller, haptic feedback, and some various different unconventional methods. But essentially what we're looking at, however beautiful it is, it's a dashboard that helps us interact with the rest of the game. Of course, there are exceptions. Sometimes the interface is the game. But yeah, we can talk about this a bit later. So yeah, what is UI? This is UI. Now, let's talk about UX, right? This one gets a bit trickier because even in some of my previous jobs, I had a title of UI UX designer. People call me a UI UX designer as well. I had colleagues that had UI UX in the title, but funnily enough, we didn't do the same types of jobs really, which was really, really peculiar. And so let's start with the definition as well, right? What is user experience? And I feel like UX, translates to user experience. And as Don Norman and Jacob Nielsen, who coined this term way back when, they state that user experience encompasses all aspects of the end user interaction with the company, its services, and its products. Pretty vague, but here's another one. The first requirement for an exemplary user experience to meet the exact needs of the customer without fuss or bother, providing not only the checklist of features, but also giving customers what the true experience, not only what they say they want, but also what they actually need without even, necessarily realizing it. And what I really like about this particular quote from Don is that user experience encompasses all of these different other disciplines, right? Including engineering, marketing, graphical and industrial design, and of course, interface design. So UX in general is about everything. So you're interacting with everything, all of these aspects of the product, and all of these aspects are important, not only the user interface. So to continue the microwave analogy, I would like to talk, about the thoughtful UX in this case. It will mean that the dashboard would not be put inside the actual microwave. the manual won't be printed at the bottom of the piece, and the actual door of it won't be opening like in a Lamborghini or something. All of these elements, they provide better UX to the end user. Well, in this case, worse UX, but you know what I mean. The fact that we're trying to make these better, provide better experience to the end user, and they do not end at the dashboard. Don Norman himself says that he coined the term because he thought that human interface and usability were too narrow, and he wanted to cover all aspects of person experience with the system or product, including industrial design, graphics, the interface, physical interaction, yada, yada, yada. Since the term itself has spread so widely, so much that sometimes it starts to lose meaning somewhat, I feel like the core is still there, right? The user experience is about all of these different aspects of the game. And I feel like in games themselves, we can find numerous different examples where there were teams, especially way back when in the early 90s, that didn't have a dedicated UX designer in the team as a person, because the field itself wasn't really that developed back then. But there were still titles that provided great user experience without necessarily having this sort of specialization. I feel like Doom is an amazing example of a game that helps the user play itself, right? Because as you can see, the position of the UI elements in this case is very thoughtful, right? You don't need to go into the pause menu each time you want to check how much health you have left, or ammo, or whatever. You have an auto map that shows you where you've been and what are the areas of the map that you haven't explored yet. Or, for example, there are sound cues that let you know that you've picked something, or you're being damaged. And I feel like thinking about UX not just in terms of the elements that are on screen, the UI elements that are on screen, but also the collection of various different methods that provide the user with the necessary information to play the game is the right way to think about this. I feel like it's important to remember that crafting great user experiences is not only a responsibility of a single person, a single specialist, whether they're called a UI designer, a UX designer, or whatever. I feel like it's the effort that should be shared by the whole team, right? Everyone is responsible, everyone in the team is responsible for UX of a product, in our case of UX of the game. And the thing is that you can see how various different aspects that are not necessarily tied with UI affect the UX of the game. If the loading time is way too long, this will affect the end UX of the game. If the control scheme is not remappable or is inconvenient, this will affect the UX of the team. Or if the audio is screeching and is harmful for ears, this will of course impact the UX of the team, even though the UI designer had nothing to do with implementing it. So I feel like that's what's important to know about the UI and UX and their distinction, is that even though a lot of times, a lot of people like to, how can you say it, put these two entities into opposition, right? Or put them so close together that they're always in kind of one spot, right? UI, UX, it's related. Of course it's related, but UX is related with every part of the project. And so it's not just about the user interface. But historically speaking, a lot of times they are tied together, so we have to live with it, and we have to, I guess, at some point just grow out of it collectively as the industry. And I just really love this picture because I feel like it pictures the absurdity of sometimes of this situation. Okay, so we talked about the fields themselves, right? Now, I wanted to touch upon the topic of people who are actually, doing these things, because a lot of times you can see the different positions, like of a UI designer, UI artist, UX designer. What do they mean? What should they mean? A lot of times I can also see quite silly mistakes, like UX artist. What does it mean, UX artist? I didn't think that this is something that that exists, but this kind of confusion occurs quite often. So let's start with the role of UI designer. What are their responsibilities? I'm going to talk about them in a second after I take a sip. So, UI designers, they are responsible for the actual, user interface, obviously. But what does it mean exactly? They are responsible for the screens and menus that should be in the game, responsible for the user flow, for either the front end, how the menus are structured, how the user should go from one point to the other. A lot of times, of course, depending on the art direction, they can build the final design as well. A lot of times they might be responsible for animation, but most likely it's going to be mostly skewed towards wireframing, layouts, what should be where, and how to organize information on screen logically and easy to digest. UI artist is like a subcategory of UI designer in some companies. Some companies kind of redirect the role of UI artist to the art departments like concept illustrators. So it can be different. Sometimes there are unicorns that can do everything essentially, which is pretty cool. But yeah, UI artists themselves, they are there to create an aesthetically pleasing and fitting look for the UI. And usually they don't design the flow. They're there to come in, look at the wireframes, look at the more primitive low fidelity versions of these screens that were laid out before by UI designer and make them prettier, make them suitable for the final product. So this is, I feel like, a good example from Anno 1800. So yeah, we have the wireframe, something that might be designed by UI designer, and we have the mock-up itself which comes up top. These are all the beautiful graphics and assets that have to adhere to the proposed wireframe, but some changes can come in, some changes might be possible because during testing on the wireframe stage, something might need to be shifted around, mixed up, blended, etc., emphasized or de-emphasized. That is possible as well. Yeah, again, another example for Jurassic World. So the idea was that on this project, the UI team was comprised mostly of UI designers. So there were no dedicated UI artists. Every asset that had to be done that was outside the scope of the design team was related to the concept art or render, or 3D rather. But yeah, we had a flexible enough, I don't want to say simple, but minimalistic enough art direction for the menus so that just the design team, just the team of UI designers could handle this. However, if there are projects like, this is like an example of my personal project that I just wanted to go all out on graphics. Like, what if I can do something that is kind of reminiscent of Blizzard's work, Blizzard's art style, and so obviously this would be much heavier. This would have much heavier emphasis on UI art aspect of it. So yeah, we talked about UI. We talked about UI designers and UI artists, but what about UX designers? And here is where things become much more complicated. So UX in general, as I mentioned before, is very it's at the same time very vague and very definitive, right? Very specific. It's about everything. It's about all of the aspects, and it's about specific aspects, both in general and very in a very narrow scope, so to say. So usually it's quite difficult to narrow down what it is, that a UX designer does, and I feel like, in general, the title of a UX designer doesn't mean too much in and of itself unless we try to specify it further. And this is where I really like some of the different models that, well, frankly, UX designers themselves came up with to kind of describe their specializations within the UX field. And so I really like this model. This is like quadrant model by Mr. Hutchinson, who was really helpful in his kind of general approach to codifying and specifying different aspects within the UX itself. And so we, broadly speaking, can separate UX, we can divide UX into 4 quadrants, 4 different fields of UX, which is experience strategy, interaction design, user research, and information architecture. These are not the only ones, obviously, so, and they're not like mutually exclusive. You can be a UX designer that is proficient in many different fields, which is great. But yeah, generally speaking, this is a helpful starting point. So yeah, what are these? Experience strategy. It's more of a business type of thing. So experience strategy deals with the way business interests and UX correlate. So if we're talking about the ways that UX can improve outreach, profitability, yada, 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 all these different things, how it impacts each other. Yeah, so this is experience strategy field. Rather broad in and of itself, and could be great if we can have time to dedicate to, explaining it on its own, but yeah, this is it. Then we have interaction design. This is like the most classic thing where thinking about UX designers, usually people think of wireframes, people think of, just tables of information and stuff like that. So this is the element that is very, very closely related to UI, closest than anything else, apart from information architecture maybe. But it also deals with control schemes, for example, new types of controllers, VR controllers, some different weird, unorthodox ways of navigation and stuff like that. So this goes into interaction design as well. User research, this is about testing, this is about asking questions, doing research in the field with the players, trying to figure out various different best practices for different types of players as well. Yeah, again, a separate field, separate business field almost, great on its own. And information architecture, again, best deals with the ways that we can best structure everything, we can best and most logically think of information within our game. And yeah, this might also impact not only user interface on its own, but all the different aspects, how we do tutorials, how we do user flows and stuff like that. I also like this other model, like the blob theory. So because these 4 categories that I mentioned before are not the only ones, obviously, we can also think about various different subcategories within them. And I really like this approach of thinking of UX designers as blobs, right? So this is me. I'm this blob. I feel like this blob right now, actually. Yeah, the thing is that we try to, this is not super duper technical scientific. This is more about you as a specialist trying to figure out what you're best in. And maybe your colleagues can also weigh in and talk about possibly your strengths. Some companies incorporate this sort of schematic into their performance reviews, team reviews, and stuff like that. But yeah, the idea is that you try to draw yourself as a blob that should in some way incorporate, cover some of the elements of each of these quadrants. And so if you say, oh, I'm a UX designer, but really keen on, well, let's say web design or design research. I really love talking with users. I really love seeing their reactions, recording stuff, yada, yada, yada. That's good, but I don't know anything about business strategy, for example. And so you draw the blob like this. All your teammates can do the same, well, within the UX team. And yeah, see how you intertwine with each other. What kind of ground do you cover and stuff like that. Kind of the other subcategory of this was presented by former UX director from Maxis, Paul Rybicki, on GDC 2017. He had another way of thinking about blobs, not within just the UX quadrants, but also just in general, various different expertises. So there are UI people that are really good with animation and game art. There are UX people that are really good into coding. We had a lot of, I myself had a lot of colleagues coming to UI design, to UX design from UI coding or gameplay coding, which is really interesting. And so, yeah, the idea is the same, pretty much. You map your blobs onto it, you see what your team excels at, and I feel like the best kind of design teams are comprised of these very diverse blobs. So yeah, we talked about UI in general, types of people that do UI stuff. We talked about UX in general, hopefully not too confusing. So I'm really looking forward to your questions afterwards. But yeah, now we can talk about types of UI. Do we still have time? We should. Yeah, okay. Cool. This right here, Beyond the Hood, is like the seminal work of the UI design, I guess. That's been done way back when, 2009. This is like a magister, like a university study. It's not necessarily a super professional work, but it's been very helpful into trying to codify and understand what types of UI there is in any particular game. It concentrated on FPS games, but it proved to be very helpful for the rest of the industry as well. And so, yeah, it's been written with the help of some of the folks from DICE, which, Battlefield series, Battlefront, stuff like that. So now I'm going to take a sip and we're going to dive into various different types, various different subcategories of UI that can exist in the game. So the actual work itself was about many different things, not just this sort of divided to various different categories, but this table right here is one of the most useful and one of the most, mainstream things that came from it. Essentially, all the user interfaces in games can be divided into this sort of table. We have non-spatial, non-diegetic, spatial, and diegetic interfaces. What does it mean? So traditional overlay HUD elements, like the most common type of UI, which is non-spatial, non-diegetic. And I feel like this is like the most common example of UIs. These are UIs that are rendered on top of a 2D plane on the screen, and they are not present within the fiction of the game. So like, if you think about user interface, usually you're thinking about non-spatial, non-diegetic, usually it's called like 2D, non-diegetic interface. Which means that, yeah, Assassin's Creed is a great example. Jurassic World from previous screens, previous slides was a great example as well. This is something that is just a normal UI. You think about the UI, it's there, all the various different gauges and button prompts and everything else. Yeah, another classic example, a mobile port of Castlevania Symphony of the Night, right? You have all these different buttons, they just exist on 2D plane to help you as a player play this game. All the various different controls and stuff like that. Then we have spatial non-diegetic UI. So this is the UI that doesn't exist for within the fiction of the game, right? So the game has the story, has the narrative lore, probably. Not every game has, but a lot of them do. And if you can see over here, I don't know how well you can see it, but like here, 18 bullets, ammo count is of the previous type of user interface, non-spatial, non-diegetic. But this right here, you can see the big thing written on top of the mention that says infiltrate the mention. This is a piece of a non-diegetic UI that doesn't exist for the main character, Sam Fisher here, but it's there for you as a player, exists to convey information. However, it exists within the 3D space of the game. So yeah, a lot of button prompts that you might see within the game when you go up closer to the object within the 3D space is there. So the hitman himself, doesn't see this button prompt. It's there for you as a player, but exists within the 3D space of the game. So spatial, non-diegetic. Then we go into another category, which is diegetic. So diegetic as a word, I've been talking about this, didn't really clear it up. Diegetic is an adjective that means something that exists within the fiction of the game, something that exists within the fantasy of the game, the lore of the game. Usually it means that it will mostly exist for characters within this game. So here, this is example of a diegetic interface where Master Chief, he sees the visor within this helmet. The HUD is like a representation from within the helmet of Master Chief. But it's still like on a 2D plane on the screen between you as a player and the 3D world of the game. And so, yeah, this is an example of a 2D diegetic interface, non-spatial diegetic interface. And the same goes for Metroid Prime, though for some reason I wanted to call it spatial, maybe because it's a 3D model in and of itself. But there is also another great example, seminal example of spatial diegetic interfaces is Dead Space, where roughly speaking, except for some of the button prompts here, this is something that exists within the fiction of the game. So Isaac Clarke here, he sees it the same thing as you, the player, and interacts with the same thing as you, the player, when you're playing this game. With the development of VR, I feel like this allows us to experiment with mixing, matching, and blending various different approaches of these four main types of UI. So, for example, in Resident Evil, you see an example of the spatial diegetic interface, and then in Alex, these sort of movement options, they're there for you as a player, but Alex obviously doesn't see a yellow line each time she wants to move like a couple of steps. So the important part here is to remember that all these different types of user interfaces are just tools. There's no better way of doing this because you as a designer need to think of this as something that improves UX first and foremost, and also improves the aesthetic quality of the game. So yeah, and obviously don't have a chance to cover everything here. However, I would really, really recommend you, if you're interested in designing not only for games but for stuff in general, software in general. So this is like the first batch of books. Don Norman, aforementioned, The Design of Everyday Things is like the Bible for a lot of UX folks. Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug centers more on web design, more on software design for apps as well, but is really important in trying to learn lessons for information architecture. Laws of UX, it's a book as well as a site, lawsofux.com, incredibly helpful in learning more about the Gestalt psychology and Gestalt in design. Incredible stuff. Obviously something closer to game industry, games in general, The Gamer's Brain and The Psychology of Video Games by Celia Hodent. Like, again, seminal works for the game industry and how stuff works. Celia also oversees the Game UX Summit. A lot of lectures from there, a lot of presentations from there are available on YouTube. I highly recommend you to check them out. And one of my personal favorites in the recent years is User Friendly by Cliff Quang and Robert Fabricant. Invaluable, amazing book about the importance of user-friendly approach in design in general. Web-wise, UX Collective, great source for a lot of things. You have to be a bit careful because there are a lot of, I would say, controversial opinion pieces there. But in general, it's great for checking the current trends or checking about more in-depth, like current information, new information on design. And also these two, probably know about them if you are in game development, game UI database and interface and game. A great place for references from various different games. If you don't have a chance to play everything, great stuff if you want to find some a specific element. Like I want to see a 2D cartoony HUD, for example, or like a main menu, and these guys show you the menus. So yeah, it's amazing. Both of these are amazing sources. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Yeah, very cool.
Do we have time for questions?
Let's do a couple of questions, and then you know at the end you can chat with Arvydas. Yeah. Do we have someone? Okay, I'll run to you.
Hey, thanks for your really great talk. Is this Doomcraft personal project? Is it just a UI collab or is it real?
This was essentially an animation, and so I did like a 3D space, a 3D animation, and just did the HUDs and interfaces on top of everything. Yeah, you can check it on my Behance. It's not playable, it's just a personal thing for fun, piece of fun art, just animated.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Do we have more people somewhere? Oh, okay.
Another one.
Hey, I'd like to ask. You mentioned that you came from the business, like web development, right? From web design. So, what was the biggest challenge? Transferring from web design to game design and user experience. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, great question. I feel like the biggest challenge was the inputs. The types of controllers, especially going from web and mobile web to mobile games in general wasn't that difficult. However, when you go into console and PC, there are big differences, especially if you want to accommodate for different platforms. Like if you want to go mobile component and then like a PC title that has a console port or vice versa. Designing with controllers in mind, keeping in mind various different conventions that might be really different, like Switch compared to PlayStation, for example, compared to PC. So keeping this all in mind was tricky. It is still tricky, but yeah, I would say this is like the biggest one.
Thanks a lot. Okay, I guess yeah. Big thanks, big applause for you.
Thank you.
And